a couple centuries later, we arrived at a man known as Augustine of Hippo. Could you tell us a little bit, who was Augustine?
Yes, he was born in 354 AD in northern Africa. He was a very bright young man. He was raised in a Christian home. The biggest influence was his very devout mother. But he was, as he would put it later, quite arrogant. He was very intelligent. He excelled in rhetoric, and he left behind his upbringing as a Christian and lived a sensual life, a life of someone who was intellectually quite successful. And he investigated various philosophies, one of which is Manichaeanism, which is a very dualistic philosophy. To oversimplify, spirit is good and matter is bad. But Augustine became disenchanted with that philosophy over a period of time. He was exposed to Christian teaching, but he had a hard time giving up his life of pleasure, especially erotic pleasure. And he's famous for saying, "Lord, give me chastity, but not yet." And then he had an experience where he was outside and he heard a little child chanting, "Take up and read, take up and read." And he opened the Bible to a particular passage which talked about putting off sensuality and sexual sin and embracing Christ. And that arrangement, conjunction of circumstances, brought him to the place of submitting to Christ. And he was in his 30s at the time, so he was an adult convert. And he was the first great systematic Christian philosopher and theologian in the West. So just about everyone has heard of St. Augustine, whether you blame him for everything bad in the world or whether you think he was an inspiration.
And one of the most known books that he wrote was The Confessions. One will find there an integration of philosophical analysis and also a biographical dimension. Do you think that is necessary to explain his philosophy?
I think it works well with his philosophy because he had a very intellectual conversion, and as a Christian he thought back on the philosophies he once held and wanted to refute them, wanted to develop a thoroughly Christian philosophy of life. For example, he uses his own experiences to speak of Christian doctrines. There's a famous case of when Augustine was a young man and he and his friends stole some pears. And they stole them just for the fun of it. They didn't need the pears. They simply wanted to do mischief. And he later reflects on that and realizes that that's really the heart of sin, that it was an act of rebellion. They knew it was wrong and they did it merely for a cheap kind of titillation. So Augustine believes that sin goes all the way down into our souls, into our being, and it takes a radical solution, that is Christ himself, to forgive us and reorient our lives. When I teach that in intro to ethics classes, the students will often think that he was just ridiculous because he was a kid and they stole some pears, and it doesn't matter because the pears didn't cost that much money probably, and they probably wouldn't do it when they got older, etc. And they miss the whole point. The whole point is that there is a radical self-centeredness and selfishness in being a human being. And this event, when properly reflected upon, brings that out. So I don't think he uses his own life in a wasteful way, the way so many modern autobiographies do or memoirs do. I think everything in there relates to his desire to be fully converted to Christ and to lead others into a Christian way of life and a Christian mindset.
And in that sense, telling an episode of how he experienced sin in his life, it's central to his philosophical ideas to explain to the others.
Well, the book truly is a series of confessions. It's a prayer. He's talking to God through the whole thing. And that was not just a device he used for literary effect. He was sincere about that.
One of his famous phrases is that when he said, "Restless is our heart until it rests in you." What did he mean by that?
Well, that was something he experienced. He couldn't find peace in his heart. He couldn't find the right way to live before he came to Christ. And he believed that we're not truly fulfilled or satisfied until we are reconciled with our Creator through the work of Christ. And this is really the essence of an approach in apologetics, which is sometimes called the argument from desire or the argument from emptiness. Pascal has been summarized as saying, there's a God-shaped vacuum in every person that only God can fill. That's a paraphrase of a longer quote that he gave. But this is important to Augustine's whole perspective, that Christianity is not simply a set of ideas about reality. It has to do with the living God who made us for himself. And that's another part of the quote, where Augustine says, you've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So if the essential relationship that we were meant for is broken by sin, then all of our other relationships and all of our thinking will be warped in some way or another. And if that alienation from God is healed through the work of Christ, which we receive by faith, then everything else changes. And it doesn't mean there's no more longing or disappointment in life, but at the most profound level, we can know that we are beloved of God, and we're also given a perspective on life that fits the facts and gives meaning to all that we do.
Now, for the sake of time, I'm skipping many medieval thinkers and moving on to the modern area of philosophy, namely with René Descartes. Now, Descartes has been considered as the father of modern philosophy. However, he also has been labeled sometimes as simply as a skeptic who, at some point, he was not even sure about even he exists, and then he finds out that he thinks, and therefore he exists. What would be a better categorization of Descartes?
Well, Descartes was an intellectual adventurer. He was trying to find certainty during a time of skepticism and where the intellectual world was somewhat unsettled after the Reformation and in light of pagan skepticism having been revived. And he realized there are things that he learned in his education that he found out were false. So he's trying to find an unshakable foundation for knowledge. So what he does in the first meditation of his book, The Meditations, is to try to doubt everything. This is called methodological doubt or hyperbolic doubt. Do I even have a body? Is there an external world? Maybe I'm dreaming and I'm not even awake. So he lays out this vast array of things that he can doubt. And then he asks, well, what could I not doubt? Is there anything that has to be the case, that has to be true? And he says, well, whatever I'm doing, thinking, doubting, willing, there's someone there. So if I'm thinking, in whatever mode of thinking, there has to be a thinker. So we have that statement, I think, therefore I am. Or it's sometimes in his writings, I think, comma, I exist. Not I think that I exist, but I think I exist. So if you think, you exist. And he thinks that that's the foundation to get out of this abyss of skepticism. So he finds in his mind the concept of God, a perfect, unlimited being. And he has a very traditional definition of God. He finds that in his mind. And he says, where could that have come from? I couldn't be the source of it because I'm limited and imperfect. It couldn't come from anything in my experience because my experience is made up of things that are contingent and finite. And I'm thinking of an infinite and perfect being. So he says, it must be that God himself gave me the idea of God, because only God would be metaphysically equipped to put that idea in my tiny, finite mind when nothing in my experience could give me that idea. And this is sometimes called the causal argument. So he believes that since he has this exalted notion of this perfect being, that it must be God who put it there, therefore God exists. And then he has another argument called the ontological argument that he gives as well. It's a little more complicated. So this idea is not taken seriously by a lot of philosophers today. I do take it seriously in my treatment of it in my book, Philosophy in 7 Sentences. I think it's at least worth pondering and considering, because the idea of a monotheistic God is utterly unlike anything in our world of experience. So it raises the question of, how could I even have that idea? Could I explain that idea merely by combining various categories of my experience as a limited, finite, contingent being? I don't know that you can. So it gets to the idea of God, and he says God must exist because God gave me the idea of God. And if God is a perfect being and he's unlimited, then he would be perfectly good. So if I seem to see a world external to myself of rocks and chairs and streams, and if I seem to have a body, then God wouldn't deceive me about that kind of a thing, because he would exist and he wouldn't be a deceiver. So Descartes argues from the inside out. He says, maybe everything outside of me is an illusion, but I am here as a thinker, and then I take an inventory of my thoughts. I have this idea of God. God put it there. That God would not be a deceiver. And then he gets the external world of events and things and processes, and he gets his own body back, so to speak. And then he's off and running. Now, how successful was he? Did he really doubt everything? He didn't seem to doubt certain principles of causation. For example, you have to have some idea of causation to use if you think that God caused you to have the idea of God, and he lays that out. So how successful was the program? There are some gaps and limits, but he's often dismissed without treating him with enough respect. I don't go into it too much in my book, but he's also famous for arguing that there's a dualism between mind and body. And those arguments are worth taking seriously as well. And a biblical view of the person is that we are a mind and a body, that we have a spirit or a mind, and we're also certainly embodied beings. So we might be able to find some argumentative help from Descartes in making the biblical case. Not to say that his view is perfectly biblical, but again, there's some material to glean, I think, from him.
Yeah, as I said, every philosophical idea would have its limits, but would he be successful in making the case that, for example, the scientism that we know today, which will claim that the only way to know things will be through the experience and experiments, if Descartes' method is right, will it succeed in refuting what scientism claims?
Well, inasmuch as there's any a priori knowledge, anything we know simply by reflecting on our own minds, that would make scientism false. Because scientism claims that knowledge only comes through scientific endeavors, and that means empirical observation, empirical theorizing. Now, the problem with scientism, or one of its many problems, is that it refutes itself, because the statement, knowledge only comes through scientific means, is not a conclusion of science. It's a principle of epistemology, and it's a very poor one, because it can't support itself. So if Descartes comes up with any knowledge without scientific methods, then he's refuted scientism in that way. Although we don't need Descartes to refute scientism. It's kind of like the icing on the cake, I guess.